All right, well, I'm Peggy Godwin, and I welcome you all here today. I didn't have any idea we would have this many people, so it's really heartwarming to see all these women learning about Nantucket extraordinary women. So, especially for the Ellen Hildebrand fans, we want you to know that Ellen is not the only extraordinary woman on the island. She really comes from a long line of extraordinary women throughout history. Nantucket was first settled in the 1600s, and from those earliest days, both men and women had to work very hard to make this struggling settlement survive. And when whaling became the dominant industry on the island, the women really had to fill the breach, and they did a remarkable job. They managed businesses in town, they managed their household affairs, they had large families that they had to raise, and they even found the time to get involved in social movements of the day. These are some of the extraordinary women on Nantucket. So today we will be looking at 15 different women, some of whom will be played in the first person, and some of whom we'll just talk a little bit about. And we're going to talk about these women who are so much ahead of their time. So our first one today is Mary Coffin Starbuck.
I am Mary Coffin Starbuck, and I am a Quaker. I didn't always used to wear such plain, drab clothes. But since I became a Quaker, this is my customary dress. I was not always a Quaker. When I was a young girl, my parents and I left the mainland of Massachusetts with a group of settlers, and many of us had no specific religious affiliation, but we wanted to get far away from the puritanical strictures that were on the mainland. So we came to Nantucket. I was only 14 at the time, but I was an educated young woman, which is quite remarkable for a 17th century woman. And within 2 years of being on island, I married a friend that I knew from the mainland, but he was one of those settlers, Nathaniel Starbuck. He and I were the first English couple to be married on Nantucket. We had the first English child born on Nantucket, and we became rather significant in time. With our wedding largesse, we started a little general store for the settlers. And it was really more like a trading post in the early days. But we ended up basically supplying not only the English, but the Wampanoag Indians with all their essentials. Since I was educated, I was the one who ran the business. I kept the books, and I ran the shop. I even became the spokesman for our family at home. So when we went to town meeting, I was always careful to say, before I spoke, my husband and I think, and then I give my opinion. Running the store, I got to know everybody on island, the English and the Indians. And in time, people started coming to me for advice and for counsel. And they're the ones who gave me the name Great Mary. So from that point on, I was known as Great Mary. Now, for the next 20, 30 years, more and more settlers came to the island, and a very diverse group of people they were. We even had people who had trades. They were weavers. They were fishermen. But they had no organized faith group. The only organized church, praying church, was found in the Indian settlement. But that changed over time, and they say it changed because of Great Mary. We used to, once in a while, have a Quaker friend who would come to the island and evangelize among the settlers. And in 1702, when I'm no longer a young girl, I'm in my 50s. John Richardson comes to the island, a Quaker friend, and he said he's evangelizing. I say, come up to our house and speak to a group of our friends. Well, Nathaniel and I were shocked at the number of people who came to our house, so many that we had to remove the windows from their frames so people standing outside could hear. Richardson was a powerful speaker. He spoke with passion and emotion, and before long, a number of us just started weeping. And I couldn't contain myself. I stood up with tears in my eyes and I said, everything we ever have been building, everything we ever have done is today pulled down because of what Richardson is saying. So I immediately embraced those Quaker ideas. But it wasn't until Thomas Story came and he said, Great Mary, why don't you hold a weekly meeting at your house? So I did. And over time, more and more people started coming so that we eventually had to build a meeting house separate, our first meeting house in town. It was quite an accomplishment. So what do Quakers believe? Well, Quakers believe that exterior doesn't matter. Our clothes, what our house is like, that doesn't matter. What matters is what is in our minds and what is in our hearts. So Quakers put a heavy emphasis on education, filling your mind with ideas and with knowledge. And not only education for men, education for women. This is radical. And as far as tapping into what's in your heart, that's where we go to meeting, at the meeting house. We Quakers would go to meeting on first day, and we Quakers go to meeting on fifth day, if we have to discuss business. On first day, we pile into the meeting house, simple, plain structure. The men are going to sit on one side, and we women sit on the other, because we don't want any distractions. There's no pulpit. There's nobody up there for music or song, nobody lining psalms. All it is a clean, pure, simple space in which we have quiet meditation, an hour or more. Our thoughts are turned inward, and in our hearts, that's where we find the truth. That's where we find what we call the inner light, the guide for how we should live our lives. It's no wonder we were considered heretics by the Puritans on the mainland. If I, as a young girl, were in Boston proselytizing the Quaker ways, I would be whipped out of the city, and I could even be put to death. The same year that I came to Nantucket with my family in 1659, a young Quaker woman, Mary Dyer, was hanged. That's why Quakers tried to find safe places, refuges, where they could worship and live in peace. So a lot of Quakers went to Sandwich. Some went to Martha's Vineyard, and eventually a lot of Quakers came to Nantucket. I have no idea what the future impact Quakers will have on our settlement, on our little community. But it is my fervent prayer that we continue to hold on to those basic principles of the Quaker faith. And it is my hope that our community continues to be a place where somebody such as myself, Great Mary, can assume a leadership role and have a voice. Thank you.
Our next woman is Abiah Folger Franklin, probably the least well-known of the women that we're going to be talking about. But she's very revered because she was the mother of Benjamin Franklin. She was a member of the Folger family of Nantucket. And she had 10 children. Benjamin Franklin was her 8th child. And he actually was not born on Nantucket. He was born in Boston, but this is where his family roots were. And he said in his autobiography of his mother, she suckled all 10 of her children and was never sick a day in her life until she died at the age of 85. Franklin and his cousin, Timothy Folger, were the two men who charted the Gulf Stream. Next, we have Kezia Coffin, who is related to Abiah, Folger, Franklin. This is Kezia Folger Coffin.
I'm Kezia Folger Coffin. I'm pretty well known around these parts for being controversial, maybe even notorious. And for the reason is that I am suspected of conducting, actually, questionable business practices. Well, I am a businesswoman and a royalist. I own a shop in which I sell needles and pins. Does that sound familiar? My husband, John Coffin, is sailing to England or somewhere. He's at sea. So many of the women and I are the ones who keep the businesses in Nantucket running. We help people running things like helping people make ends meet, and we are bringing up our families, of course. My business enterprises occupy a great deal of my time these days, as out of necessity, I have experienced my, what have I experienced? My interests to include many kinds of goods, not just needles and pins. I have expanded my businesses into selling properties, buying properties, opening up more stores, and lending money to those who are suffering from the hard times of being part of the rebellion against the crown. And that makes me sort of like a bank, you know? And then I buy shares or invest in shares in merchant ships, etc. Of course, I have the distinct advantage of being the cousin to Benjamin Franklin. Abiah Folger Franklin, his mother, is my aunt. So I have I was able to become the only Nantucket representative of a leading London trading house. Because of my connections and my success as an entrepreneur, I see nothing wrong with trading with the British for goods that are not otherwise available on Nantucket. And I also see nothing wrong with charging higher prices for those. Does that sound familiar? So, in some Nantucket circles, I am known as the she merchant or the pirate merchant. Isn't that exciting? I love it. I was even put on trial as a traitor for smuggling and for treason, together with some of my male cohorts. They prosecuted us because they considered us as dangerous criminals and aiders and abettors to the British. How absurd. Ugh. However, if we had been found guilty, the punishment is death. So I was the only woman in this group. Even my husband, he was at sea, as usual, and was not a part of this happening. The charges were finally dropped thanks to my son-in-law, my lawyer son-in-law, Phineas Fanning, who is married to my daughter, Kezia Coffin, Jr. So everything turned out all right. Oh, let me address the subject of smuggling for a minute. Some people say that I was running a lucrative business out of my country home in Quays. And you'll see Quays is where the star is on the map. They say that I had a private passage, partially concealed, leading from the house to the beach. And that is where they thought that little boats would come in late in the evening to deliver goods, contraband goods like liquor and other things like that. And that they would store them, I would store them beneath the house in Quays. This was only rumored because of a nosy Nantucketer there. Well, unfortunately, my downfall came when Nantucket claimed neutrality with the British, with the Revolution. I lost my monopoly because all the other merchants could do exactly what I'd been doing. And they had access to all these goods that previously only I could provide. So eventually I had to declare bankruptcy and was forced to sell my many properties, my warehouses, my other holdings, all of which sold at auction for ridiculously low prices, thanks to some scheming neighbors in Nantucket. Ugh. Well, when they came to repossess my own home, I was infuriated. And I wouldn't move. I wouldn't leave. So, you know what I did? I sat in my chair and I would not move. So you know what they did? They picked me up bodily in the chair and removed me. Well, I was later disowned by the Quaker meeting. But you know why? Just because I bought a spinet, which is like a piano, for my daughter Kezia. What's wrong with that? Anyway, I made a fortune and I lost a fortune. But that's all there is to that. So, they even said when all this was going on that I lacked principle. Really? I can't believe that. How could they say something like that? Anyway, that's who I am. I'm not in jail. And thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you, Kezia. Our next woman is Lucretia Coffin Mott. Lucretia was born on Fair Street, which is just right up at the top of Main Street, to Quaker parents, and she learned as a child to lead a self-determined life. Her description of Nantucket indicates the unusual place that women occupied. She said, during the absence of husbands, Nantucket women have been compelled to transact business, often going as far away as Boston to procure supplies. They have kept their own accounts and indeed acted the part of men. Today, she is primarily known as an abolitionist and a women's rights leader. She always spoke also on behalf of Native Americans. In 1848, she helped to organize the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, along with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And very soon, Lucretia Coffin Mott is going to be pictured on the $10 bill. So look for her picture soon as they start to print out new $10 bills. And next is Eliza Ann Chase McCleave. Eliza was married to Captain Robert McCleave, who often was out whaling all over the world, and he brought back many souvenirs and artifacts and oddities so that he could share the adventures that he was having with his wife. In those days, they didn't have postcards, they didn't have T-shirts to bring back, so men brought back curiosities. And after a few voyages, Eliza had so many interesting things that this enterprising young lady decided to display them on the second floor of her home, which is at 109 Main Street, still stands today. And then she decided to charge a fee so that she could show people all these interesting artifacts that she had. So she had a little museum on the second floor, and she had benches around the museum, as you can see in the picture here. And every day she would give a lecture on one of the artifacts. She gained a reputation for giving such colorful accounts that one of the early guidebooks wrote of her and said her museum was worthy of a visit for the curiosities it contains, but more especially for their graphic description by the proprietress. The success of her museum must have inspired many of the Nantucket Historical Association's founders. Now, not all women stayed at home. Some captains' wives chose to accompany their husbands on whaling voyages. One such woman was Nancy Grant, who accompanied her husband Charles Grant for 32 years at sea. She must have absolutely loved life at sea, and believe me, it was not an easy life. The woman that we're going to meet next is Susan Veeder, who also chose to accompany her husband at sea.
I am Susan Veeder. My husband Charles was commander of the Nantucket whale ship, the Nauticon, and I chose to go whaling with him for 4 years on an adventure hunting whales in the South Pacific. Now, only the captain's wife was allowed to go on these whaling voyages, so this was very special, and I did want to go. I missed my husband. He was always away at sea. I missed him terribly. But I also wanted to see a wider world beyond the shores of Nantucket. And so off we went. I kept a journal during this voyage. It was my constant companion, and I wrote in it every day. And I'll be sharing parts of my journal with you today. We departed in September of 1848. It was a sad departure because I had to leave my children behind. We did take our older son with us. We had very rough seas. I was terribly seasick. I was also 5 months pregnant. But it really got terrible when we were rounding Cape Horn. There are ferocious storms in this area. Many a ship was lost here, and that Nauticon was battered to and fro by heavy winds and high seas, and I was heavy with child. But we made it. I read from my journal, I think that if I could have gone on shore, I should have given up the voyage, for I was very sick. The nights are so short that I am abed about half of the day, and the captain is all attention. He says he is very happy to think I am here and encourages me by saying that he thinks I get along first rate. I was put ashore in Chile to give birth to our baby. I was put at the home of the American consul, a Mr. Crosby. He and his wife were very kind to me. I write in my journal about the room. The room is quiet, secluded, and nicely furnished. Mrs. Crosby, the consul's wife, is very sociable and friendly. It's very pleasant to be in the family. And my baby was born there, Mary Frances. She was 9 pounds, a healthy baby girl. Charles stayed with us for 3 weeks, but then he had to go whaling again, and he left me there. And then I became very depressed. I write, I feel quite feeble to be left among strangers, and I feel very lonesome. But my captain returned to pick Mary Frances and myself up, and we went back on the whale ship, and we went a-whaling. Mary Frances was a fine child, very healthy. She was crawling around the deck. She was more than a year old and doing wonderfully until something terrible happened. Hard to talk about, so I should read it from my journal. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Mary Frances was taken ill, and we very soon saw that there was no hope for her recovery. We sent immediately for a physician, and everything was done that could be done, but all in vain. The physician thought that it was teething, and so he lanced her gums. And then he gave us a white powder to put on the wounds. The powder was poison. She was likely poisoned by taking the second powder. What can be done? What can be done was all that we could say. The thought of losing our babe was more than we could bear to think of. She was a fine child, too good to live. And at 11 o'clock in the morning, she breathed her last. She died in Tahiti at 13 months. We put her body in a lead coffin for preservation and burial back on Nantucket. I could not bury her in Tahiti in some remote, foreign place where I could never visit her grave. I often ask myself, would my baby have died if we were on Nantucket? I don't know, but I prefer to dwell on the positive. What was good is that my husband was with me during this tragedy, and he was a great support. Well, now on to lighter things. You might wonder about my living conditions on board the ship, and they were quite good. The captain and I had 2 rooms, our bedroom and a living room. The living room became our dining room in the evening, where we would dine with the officers. And we dined well. We had good food. We had fruits and vegetables that we traded and bartered for among the natives of the villages. We had meat, we had fish and fowl. We had livestock on board the ship. Pigs and chickens and goats. In Polynesia, my husband took on 22 pigs, and the ship was beginning to look like a zoo. So I said, I think that is enough livestock. Relations with the crew, I write about this. They were very good. I was nurse to the crew. I was tutor to the crew. Many of the men could not read or write. And I was also a navigator. Being educated on Nantucket in the Quaker tradition, I knew math and science. I knew astronomical calculations, celestial navigation. And my husband taught me how to navigate the ship. He was very proud of me. The crew loved having me on board because I kept the captain in a good mood. And that meant less punishment. I could not abide flogging. That did not happen when I was on board. I baked for the crew. I made them gingerbread and donuts. We would fry the donuts in whale oil. Delicious. And of course, all this good food was washed down by some lovely Madeira wine. A hard part of being on the ship was laundry. We had to wash on the ship and hang the laundry in the rigging. Can you imagine my embarrassment with my undergarments flapping in the breeze among 30 men? That's why I really liked to wash off the ship on the shore, and I write about it in my journal. Here I write, we're in the Cocos Islands in Costa Rica. It is one of the best places to wash clothes I ever saw. The captain has had a tent put up so we can wash comfortable. On shore today, I had a fine shower. I did a lot of ironing. The clothes, if I was hanging them in the rigging, never dried. The salt air and the wet made them damp. I had to iron and iron to keep the mildew at bay, and my skirts at the time had 10 yards of fabric. So I was kept very busy ironing. I had great adventures. I saw the eruption of a volcano in the Galapagos. We were stuck in the Arctic ice for 13 days at one point. That was scary. I really didn't think I'd ever see Nantucket or my family again. But after 13 days, we ran out of food and fuel. We did break through the ice, and we were homeward bound. Thank goodness to Nantucket. We returned home in March of 1853. Our family was at the dock to meet us. I hardly recognized one of my sons. He was a little boy when we left. We came back, and he was a man. We had Mary Frances in her little metal coffin with us, and we buried her here in Newtown Cemetery. I will lie next to her when it is my turn. So, we're all back on Nantucket. I never went whaling again. I'm glad I went. But after that, I was very happy to stay home, raise my family, and enjoy this beautiful island that we call home. That is my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Mariah Mitchell. Mariah is probably our most famous citizen. Mariah was one of 10 children in the Mitchell family, and at an early age, she showed quite an aptitude for mathematics and astronomy. Her father was an amateur astronomer, so he sort of tutored her in astronomy. And she also attended island schools. By the time she was 14, she was so proficient at astronomy that she was able to do the necessary calculations to set chronometers for the ship's captains. So if her father was away, Mariah could take over that job. She worked as the first librarian at the Athenaeum, which is our library, and a job she held for 20 years. But all the while that she was at the library, she was still pursuing her interest in mathematics and astronomy. In 1847, she made a very important discovery. She was 29 years old. Mariah was up in the roof of the Pacific National Bank, which is at the top of Main Street, which is where her father worked, and she had her telescope out. And she was looking out at the night sky, and she noticed a very large flash in the sky. And she was sure that it was a comet, and she was right. The new comet, which was previously uncharted, became known as Miss Mitchell's Comet. She had discovered this comet. So in recognition of this very important discovery, Mariah was presented with a gold medal from the King of Denmark, which was rather a precursor for the Nobel Prize for Science, now given by Sweden. This recognition brought her a lot of respect and even more recognition when, in 1848, she became the first woman to be named to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 1857, 1858, Mariah left Nantucket to travel in the United States and abroad, and then she became a professor of astronomy at Vassar College, where she was a very well-liked, well-respected educator. Mariah said, "Our want of opportunity was our opportunity. Our privations were our privileges. Our needs were our stimulants. We are what we are partly because we had little and wanted much, and it is hard to tell which was the more powerful factor." Mariah has a big birthday coming up. 2018 marks the 200th anniversary of her birth on August 1st, 1818. Not only men sailed the seas hunting whales. Occasionally, women disguised themselves as men and shipped aboard whale ships. Some did it for the adventure, others to escape the monotony of housework, others just to make money. In 1848, Rebecca Ann Johnson shipped out as George Johnson aboard the Christopher Mitchell. Johnson was a real woman. We know that she grew up in Rochester, New York, and that she was 19 years old when she shipped out of Nantucket. No one knows why she did what she did. Because we have few verifiable facts about Rebecca, here is a fun way to imagine her story.
Gather, ye ladies, as I wish to tell, the tale of a man ne'er-do-well. 'Twas this man from Nantucket doth inspired me to transform myself to a whaler at sea. I'm Rebecca Ann Johnson of Petticoat Row. The morning baker, I proof all the dough. He'd come in at 12 for his daily bread, no ring on his finger, seemed he was not wed. Each day I'd anticipate the noonday hour and hope that my face wasn't covered in flour. As the days they went on, we grew more close. There was even a time he brushed flour from my nose. By spring, a fine romance it did bud. What began as a flutter soon became love. I'll admit that my actions were not quite Quaker, but a brand new yearning in me he'd awakened. 'Twas summer too soon, his worship provisioned. We kissed goodbye, oh how much I would miss him. My baking, it kept me from lining the pier, but when noonday struck, I couldn't hold back my tears. Precisely at noon, the very next day, a lady came in, and I heard her say, "My husband's a whaling, of him you must know. Our bread he bought daily. Could I get a loaf?" Oh, how my cheeks burned. My knees, they grew weak. I wanted to scream, but I could barely speak. How could this man have tarnished my name, played with my heart like a ball in a game? Awake all that night, I hatched up a plan. I'd go whaling to find him. I'd dress as a man. From my brother's trunk, his clothes I did borrow. The Christopher Mitchell, she set sail tomorrow. At dawn I awoke and shed all my locks. I bound up my bosom and rushed to the docks. To the captain I said, "My name is George. I'd like to go whaling. May I come aboard?" Soon my soft hands grew blistered and rough. But for someone green, I was quite tough. I even helped right that ship in a squall. I was strong despite being small. Off the coast of Peru in the 7th month, to an illness severe, I had succumbed. I was sent to the forecastle and ordered to rest. It seems drunken with fever, I pulled the muslin from my chest. The first mate came in and suddenly screamed. He quickly realized things weren't what they seemed. Up the ladder he scrambled, he was aghast. "Oh, Captain, my captain, the lad is a lass!" So my lover, sadly, I never found, because they dispatched me when we came aground. And if I had found him, what would I have done? The options, perhaps too graphic to mention. As George on that journey, I was quite brave, the crew and the captain that I helped save. But now, as Rebecca on Nantucket, I remain, but I refuse to let my clothes ever define me again.
Rebecca Ann Johnson or George Johnson, whichever you prefer. Mary Ellen Pleasant. Mary Ellen was an African-American woman who came to Nantucket in 1827 as a young bonded servant to Grandma Hussey. She worked out her bondage, then became a family member and lifelong friend to Hussey's granddaughter, Phoebe Hussey Gardner. The Husseys were deeply involved in the abolition movement, and Pleasant was able to meet many famous abolitionists. She worked on the Underground Railroad, transporting slaves to Ohio and as far away as Canada. She brought her interest in the abolition movement to California during the California Gold Rush. In California, she ran an exclusive men's dining establishment and identified herself as a capitalist by profession. In 1866, Pleasant successfully attacked racial discrimination in San Francisco public transportation after she and 2 other women were ejected from a city streetcar. And next is Eliza Starbuck Barney. Eliza was a suffragette. She was an abolitionist, but she was also an amateur genealogist. She kept very careful genealogical records of all the Nantucket families. And her genealogical work is really a priceless legacy because it has become the basis for the NHA's genealogical records. So we have a lot of people who come to Nantucket to do their own family research, but also research on other Nantucket families. Eliza lived in the house that you see pictured here. It was built for her by her son Nathaniel. It is a beautiful example of Italianate architecture. It still stands at 73 Main Street, so if you take a little stroll up Main Street, it is the blue house, just as you go into the residential area. Anna Gardner. Anna was born on Nantucket and grew up in an abolitionist Quaker family. You seem to hear this theme throughout all of our women. At the age of 22, she began to teach at the African school, pictured right here in the photo in the middle. She had 50 pupils in one room, and she taught all levels up to the 9th grade. She was at the center of the segregation issue, as one of her students, Eunice Ross, attempted to enroll at the island's high school. She had passed the entrance exam, but she was denied entry because of her race. Anna resigned her teaching position, not just in protest, but also she decided to devote herself to the cause of equality for African Americans. Anna received a heart-shaped pin from her students in recognition and in honor of her quest for equal education. Today, that pin is in our collection, and you can see her wearing it in the first photo. Gardner, with the help of others, including the aforementioned Eliza Starbuck Barney, also initiated the island's first anti-slavery convention on Nantucket. The convention included speeches by many well-known abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Lydia Folger Fowler was a sixth-generation descendant of one of our earliest settlers, Peter Folger, one of the earliest Englishmen to arrive on the island. Lydia was a pioneering American physician, the second woman in America to earn a medical degree, the first American-born woman to do so. She grew up on Nantucket. She was educated in local schools. One of her teachers was William Mitchell, the father of Maria Mitchell, the astronomer and mathematician, but she also went to other schools. She later attended Wheaton Female Seminary. Next, we will have a businesswoman par excellence.
Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you that I don't already know, I'm Margaret Getchell. I was born on this beautiful island in 1841. And at the age of 21, I quit my teaching job and headed for New York, Manhattan, to work in R.H. Macy's struggling fabric store. R.H. Macy was born on Nantucket as well, and family legend has it that he and I are distant cousins. In any case, he hired me as an executive. This was a first for a female to have that kind of position. And after only 4 years that I was there, the store tripled in size, and we became known as the first modern American department store in this country. You heard me say tripling the merchandise. I got very bored early on of selling fabrics, so that was one of the reasons that I had all that merchandise. And then another thing that I was really known for in New York were my legendary window displays. Let me tell you, they were the talk of the town, and I am sure that the competition was looking at them. The other thing, during my stay in just only 4 years, I had a soda fountain put into Macy's. This would be the first soda fountain ever put in a department store. I was good at math, but I also had excellent marketing ideas. And so I made sure, in order to get to that soda fountain, you had to go through lots of merchandise. Okay, so I had a motto: be everywhere, do anything, and always astonish the customers. The other thing I was always doing was putting a bug in my boss's ear, and he listened. Eventually, my husband became a partner at Macy's, and I was asked to surrender my salary. However, I want to thank Mr. Macy. He was ahead of his time to hire me in the first place as an executive and as a female executive. And he was way ahead of his time, but also because I was so successful at what I did, I hope I paved the way for women to get better paying jobs in Manhattan and then elsewhere all over this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Our next presenter will tell you about two rather unusual Quaker sisters, but only one of them will be with us today. The sisters followed the Quaker principle of inner light, but they could not have been more different from the other Quaker women that we have already discussed today. They arrived on the island, excuse me, they arrived on the island at a time when Nantucket has ceased to be a whaling center, so Nantucketers were reinventing themselves. And this was just beginning to be a resort destination and an art colony. Their island home still stands today, and it is one of the historic properties that you can visit in season. So our next person is Hanna Monaghan.
Good afternoon. Let me introduce myself. I'm Hanna Monaghan. I've been told that I'm not as artistic as my sister Gertrude, who is an artist, but I am very dramatic. And growing up in this Pennsylvania home as a Quaker household, I would jokingly say to my sister and I that we were bit by a virus under the pseudonym of art. How it entered this sanctuary and hit the two of us who came from a long line of Quaker martyrs cannot be explained. But it hit its two victims, my sister and I, and afterward we lived for nothing but art. After completing our education, we decided, my sister and I, that we needed an art studio to work out of. We were told that if we went to Nantucket and got a studio there, that this would be the perfect place. It was sleepy and quaint, and so we rented a studio on Nantucket. Once we arrived on the island, we found it was absolutely perfect for what we were looking for. It was picturesque and alive with art. One day, a few weeks after our arrival, we were driving up Main Street, and we suddenly discovered we were following a herd of cattle. And being naturally curious, we decided to follow the cattle, and we did. And this gentleman that had the cattle was taking them to a barn just off of Main Street. While we watched the gentleman put the cattle into the barn, we noticed that it had a lovely salt box art structure. And we decided that it was going to be the perfect place for us to have a studio and a home. Even though the first floor had cattle, and underneath were pigs and a pigsty where the neighbors put their swill, we inquired as to who owned the barn, and we were told that it was owned by a shopkeeper on Main Street, who was not going to be inclined to sell the barn, especially to off-islanders. Well, Gertrude and I are devout Quakers, and as Quakers we believe that everything in our lives happens as a result of divine influence. So for finding and acquiring this building from the owner, which we were eventually able to do, was definitely God's will. While the reconstruction of our barn was going on, people would walk by and observe. I called them peepers, and they would make observations and comments. One of the comments that I observed was, once a pigsty, always a pigsty. The townspeople literally took sides in our reconstruction. There were the against, architecture is precedent. It is following the accepted forms, and if it deviates, it is bad. And there were the fors. Art is experimentation, it is creative. Fortunately, when our barn was finished, Gertrude and I are scavengers with money. And so we were able to furnish our barn with the expensive and cheap objects that we really, really liked. And because of our deep spirituality, when it came time to name our barn, the passage from Genesis came to mind. And the passage reads, "And God made two lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night." And so Greater Light is now the name of our home. Reaction to our house today is both informative and interesting. I seldom step into the street without a group of peepers hanging around and remarking, "How could you have built this so long ago? It was not stylish then." I answer them with, "I did not plan it. Divine mind knows." Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna. And next we have Mildred JEWETT. Madaket Millie, better known as Madaket Millie. Millie was a lifelong resident of the island, spending most of her time at her grandmother's homestead in Madaket at the western end of the island. She was a champion scallop shucker, and as a child, she dreamed of being in the United States Coast Guard. The American services did not accept women in those days until the outbreak of World War II. However, Millie was denied enlistment in the Coast Guard due to health concerns. So she spent her most of her war years training dogs, running her ice cream stand, and patrolling the coast. She was always out looking for shipwrecks, spies, and vessels in distress. Due to her 40-year dedication to the mission of the Coast Guard, Millie was made an honorary Chief Warrant Officer in 1984. Millie was quite a character, and we have been told that at times she kept eels and snakes in her bathtub. She was great buddies with Mr. Rogers of children's TV fame, and who was also a Madaket resident. She has even been honored on a Cisco Brewery beer can. So Cisco Brewery is one of our wonderful stops in Nantucket, and now they have a picture of Madaket Millie on the beer can. William Oliver Stevens, an American author and professor, wrote, "Indeed, it is probable that no other community in America of the size of Nantucket has ever given the country so many extraordinary women." Today, that tradition continues. Certainly all the Ellen Hildebrand fans know that she's an extraordinary woman, but there are lots of other extraordinary women on Nantucket. We actually started to make a list of all the women who hold leadership positions in the community. And we discovered that it was so extensive that we didn't want to leave anybody out, but we know that there are at least 125 women on the island who either own their own businesses, run not-for-profit organizations, or are involved in town government. So at this point, I'd like to have a curtain call and call out our wonderful NHA interpreters who wrote their own scripts, and these are also extraordinary Nantucket women. So first, Mary Coffin Starbuck, played by Linda Steelman. And Kezia Folger Coffin, played by Elizabeth Gilbert. Susan Veeder, Karen McNabb. Rebecca, or George, Johnson, Rebecca Chappa. Margaret Getchell, Ann Swidell. Hanna Monaghan, Barbara Stott. And I'd also like to introduce our stage managers and tech support. Maria Grouse, and Emma Sanderson. Emma, stand up. And to end our program today, there's a wonderful poem called the Nantucket Girls Song. And another one of our extraordinary Nantucket interpreters, Susan Berman, who unfortunately could not be with us today, but she has set this poem to music.
Well, I've made up my mind now to be a sailor's wife, have a purse full of money and a very easy life. For a clever sailor husband is so seldom at his home that a wife can spend the dollars with a will that's all her own. So I'll haste to wed a sailor, then I'll send him off to sea. For a life of independence is the pleasant life for me. Oh, but every now and then I shall like to see his face, for it always seems to me to beam with manly grace, with his brow so nobly open and his dark and kindly eye. Oh, my heart beats fondly whenever he is nigh. But when he says, goodbye, my love, I'm off across the sea. First I'll cry for his departure, then I'll laugh because I'm free. I will welcome him most gladly whenever he returns, and share with him so cheerfully the money that he earns. For he is a loving husband, though he leads a roving life. And well, I know how good it is to be a sailor's wife. So I'll haste to wed a sailor, then I'll send him off to sea. For a life of independence is the pleasant life for me. Oh, but every now and then I shall like to see his face, for it always seems to me to beam with manly grace, with his brow so nobly open and his dark and kindly eye. Oh, my heart beats fondly whenever he is nigh. But when he says, goodbye, my love, I'm off across the sea. First I'll cry for his departure, then I'll laugh because I'm free. So Nantucket girls, please hear me and join in with this song. Hold fast to the traditions of great women, brave and strong. For the women steer this island quite well, there is no doubt, and do the things most other girls can only dream about. So I'll haste to wed a sailor, then I'll send him off to sea. For a life of independence is the pleasant life for me. Oh, but every now and then I shall like to see his face, for it always seems to me to beam with manly grace, with his brow so nobly open and his dark and kindly eye. Oh, my heart beats fondly whenever he is nigh. But when he says, goodbye, my love, I'm off across the sea. First I'll cry for his departure, then I'll laugh because I'm free. Oh yes, I'll cry for his departure, then I'll laugh because